In our study of 1 Corinthians, we are now ready for chapters 5 and 6. Now, ordinarily, they are divided into two thought patterns, but I do not think that's really true. Ordinarily, in chapter 5, the subject is about a person guilty of fornication, that is, incest with his stepmother. And then chapter 6 about not going to law with brethren. But I see these two chapters as a unit of talking about the same thing, and he's still on this subject of fornication throughout all of chapter 6, and I think you'll see that as we progress through it. So I admonish you once again, keep your Bible open and follow word for word. You'll get far more out of it if you will do that. Now, we've already seen that he is giving them an admonition not to think more highly of men than they ought to think, that I'm of Paul, of Apollos, of Peter, and so forth. But he still brings that in chapters 5 and 6 also. It has an aspect of that. As we see in the first 6 chapters, he is answering questions that were brought to him by means of a delegation from the house of Chloe in Corinth. And then starting in chapter 7, he answers questions that he had received by means of a letter. Now, in chapter 5, he says this: it is reported commonly, or literally commonly, actually it is reported that there is fornication among you, or in the realm or sphere of you, in your midst there, in the church, in the assembly at Corinth. So he says, it is actually reported that there's fornication in your midst of believers, and not just fornication, but he says, and such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles, that is, the heathen nations. Now he says it's something that's not even acceptable to others. Now, this thing of living together, Jewish and Roman law prohibits such relationships as this. Now, back in the book of Leviticus, chapter 18 and verses 7 and 8, and there are many, many other portions in the Old Testament law concerning this type of a relationship. Now notice in Leviticus 18 and beginning with verse 7, the nakedness of thy father or the nakedness of thy mother shalt thou not uncover. She is thy mother. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. Now, he's not just talking about uncovering and looking and seeing. He's talking about sexual relationship. Verse 8 says, the nakedness of thy father's wife shalt thou not uncover. It is thy father's nakedness. Now, the Old Testament law prohibits such things, and such kind of sins on many occasions were punishable by death. Now, notice here he says, it is actually reported in your midst there in the church at Corinth that there is fornication among you, and such is not so much as named among the Gentiles. And what kind of a sin was that? That even the heathen didn't even approve of. That one should have his father's wife. Now, he's saying that his father's wife would be not his mother, but his stepmother. So he has his father's wife. Now he said this kind of a sin is not acceptable in any area of life, even in heathen life, much less in the realm of Christianity and in the church. Now he says, and you're puffed up, and you're still proud and haughty and arrogant about your position. I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Peter, and so forth. You're still all puffed up and arrogant and haughty about these things, and have not rather mourned. The fact that you have this kind of a situation with a brother in your midst that is committing and living in this kind of a sin, and you've not rather mourned that, a purposive clause, in order that he who having done this deed might be taken away from among you. Now he says, you ought to be grieved over this situation. You ought to be mourning and weeping over it, and prayerfully that this person will be taken from your midst. Now notice what Paul goes on to say here. For I verily or truly, as absent, present participle, as being absent in body. Of course, it's obvious he's not there in body. He's in Ephesus. So he says, being absent in body, but present, or being present in spirit. Now he says, my spirit is with you. I have judged already. Now, the word have judged is one word, and it means I've decided, I've made a decision. It's a word that speaks of a mental or judicial decision. So I've made a mental and judicial decision already, as though I were present, as though I were being there right with you, concerning him who having done this deed, who hath so done this deed, the one that has worked out or wrought this kind of a deed of having sexual relations with his stepmother, his father's wife.